me in a nutshell. I've started companies before and sold one and helped another one go public by all means. And that's sort of it, all in the biotech space. Okay?
Amazing. Thanks.
Good. Everybody feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or otherwise. Like, I'm always happy to chat and help, okay? All right, so we only got a few slides here. The majority should be discussion, as I mentioned. We have these couple of segments here: setup, challenges, software versus biotech. A couple of case studies. I tried to update some of them. Fundraising considerations and conclusions. Okay. All right. So the setup is like, why do biotech at all versus software? Well, the main difference that I see that biotech is usually significantly more driven by mission on the human condition, right? So software too can and often does help with the human condition, but biotech has a closer connection, especially on the red biotech, as I talk about it, which is essentially biomedical applications, right? So people get sick, people die, such as children, and then there's a whole bunch of very strong statements around this because all of these things that we're dealing with, Parkinson's, Huntington's, cancer, and all these other things, that's all what biotech is trying to fix at the root of it, right? The human condition, the red biotech. But there's more, right? There's agriculture, there's aquaculture, there's protein and diagnostics and tools. So biotech is a very large and diverse field. Don't need to remind you of that. But this is where a difference exists, I think, principally to some of the not as strong mission-driven software plays. So it's a different group of people that you recruit, and it's a different kind of risk that you also take. Right? We'll talk about that in a second. All right. So basically, there is a bunch of biotechs, and I've color-coded them here for easier reference. So red, therapeutics and diagnostics, because of the blood, of course. Green, agriculture, anything that we do to agriculture in order to improve it, or whatever else, like green because of the plants. White biotech is industrial processes. There's a lot of biotech that is running on industrial processes such as fermentation and or the manufacture of other things, right? But then there's a bunch of new ones. Blue biotech. All right, aquaculture, fish and algae, there's a lot of that going around now. How can you make better salmon? And there's specific salmon that has increased levels of omega-3 fatty acids, which help you on your mental health. They've been improved, right? And there's a whole bunch of algal utilization for that. Not so much for biofuels anymore, but really for maybe protein production. So that actually brings me to the next one, pink biotech, mostly because of the proteins, right? So alternative proteins, very important, structured meats, etc. Most everything food related, I want to group into this bucket of pink biotech. And that's actually materially different in 2021 than it was in 2019. There's been this explosion and increase of companies that have started in the food and feed space, right? For us as humans, as we are learning how to deal with processes to make meat-like substances, and meat is the primary issue, right? Like, so we don't have an issue with plants. They're again very, very efficient and economical. Meat is not, right? Meat is an enormously wasteful process, especially beef, the most wasteful of them all. Chicken's actually pretty good, and then fish proteins depends a little bit, and sort of hogs are in the middle. But basically, beef is enormously wasteful and one of the primary drivers of climate change here for us in the United States, aside from fossil fuels. The reason is that the feed that goes into feeding cows, aside from the water, also consumes an enormous amount of energy because of fertilizer that is used for making the feed, which then gets used by the cows and so on and so forth. So the entire value chain for the energy chain for making a pound of muscle protein in a cow is just terrible. That's why there's actually a lot of innovation in the space. And the reason that there's innovation in the space, there's some trailblazers, we'll talk about one of them. They actually make alternative proteins taste like actual meat. And this is a fun story I'll tell them. But basically, don't try to change humanity. It may sound weird, but basically we as humans are incredibly resistant to change when it comes to our diet and other things like that, right? Like if it doesn't taste like meat, like, that's not, it's like a bean burger, I won't eat that. That's not meat. Don't try to tell me it's meat. So if you actually want me to eat alternative healthy meat, just make it taste like meat, right? No big deal. So basically don't ask me to change, but just make your product better. I think that's an important part about product market fit that we can discuss a little bit. All right, so it's like in software, a lot of it is about PMF here in the biotech space, if you phrase it that way. And then gray biotech, there's space biotech that also exists, right? So we're thinking about shooting people into space for long periods of time. They got to eat, they got to live, they got to get medicine and so on and so forth. So space biotech is a consideration as well, and sometimes it translates fairly nicely, and sometimes there's some gnarly things there. We'll talk briefly about that. Okay, And then last but absolutely not least, life sciences tools and services. It's an interesting bucket we should discuss, and if you have questions about that, there's actually an inverse hierarchy between the direct access to the human condition and the funding needs and or the regulatory requirements, right? So inversely correlated, which might make it very interesting for certain folks to get started in this space. Like Omri, for example, got started in the tool space with Genome Compiler, very successful, right? So success is not gated on actually making a therapeutic or a diagnostic. Having said that, if you want to make a therapeutic and that works, that is usually $1 billion plus company. So there's like, it's very binary in that case, okay? All right. Biotech, the century of biotech. You may have heard it before, and I'm gonna say it again here. It's like there is an enormous realization that the tools that we have developed collectively as humanity have accelerated our ability to influence living organisms, right? Whether it's us or the aquaculture or the agricultural environment, whatever it is, we have increased ability, which is a lot of times driven by impressively powerful computational tools and just a successive iteration and the deployment of enormous amounts of capital to really innovate in this space. Right, so that's really, really important. And lastly, sometimes it just takes a while. It takes a while for an industry to really accelerate. The semiconductor industry didn't really exist until somebody figured out how to make semiconductors and how to make integrated circuits and all that other stuff, and how to standardize some of these processes. We are getting to that level where it's less artisanal and a little bit more standardized. So you can think of the analog. If you're familiar with in the 70s, there was something called the VLSI, the Very Large Scale Integrated Circuit Initiative, which essentially disaggregated the fabrication of chips from the design of chips, okay? Right now, within biotech, it's still pretty aligned, right? If you are the designer, even of gene circuits or medicines, oftentimes you're also the manufacturer of the same thing. Like Pfizer designs and manufactures medicines. That is certainly not true anymore in the chip world, right? I mean, TSMC and others like make a lot of the chips, and other people just integrate them. So this integration versus manufacturing, design, integration, manufacturing, these are all separate functions nowadays in the semiconductor industry, but they're not the same separated in the biotech industry. And that we see a little bit of a deconvolution happening now. And then thirdly, we see an enormous amount of recycling of talent. So we've had a couple of successful waves of new companies getting started and just increasing the population of capable talent. And that just doesn't mean scientists, but it also means leaders who can actually lead scientists through this maze of drug development or diagnostics development or agricultural development, because everything is complicated, and having been through the fight a few times really improves your chances of success, right? So it's a very trivial statement, but tautologically accurate. The best predictor of future success in this space is past success. If you don't have past success, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be successful, but that just means that the alpha is higher, the variability is higher. Okay. The problem with all of this is that the talent tends to be very heavily...
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said. Sorry, could you say that again?
All right, that was my weird watch that wanted to talk to me. So the talent can be really concentrated. Doesn't mean that it's not concentrated in Tel Aviv or Rehovot, where the Weizmann is, but it's not as concentrated as it is in, for example, Boston or in San Francisco or even San Diego, or some other places around it. Those places are just insanely dense. Again, doesn't mean that you don't have to move there, but you just got to recognize that there's some talent gradients that exist, right? It's just sparser in some places. China, nobody knows what's going on there, but I know that a lot of things are cooking there. Capital is, interestingly enough, everybody says like, oh, capital is cheap and plentifully available. It's true and it's not true, right? It's cheap and it's plentifully available if you know just the right kind of people. It's, I guess, how it's always been, but in this particular case, there's just more of the right people around. So I think it is true that capital is fractionally more available, and the pools of capital that are available are certainly deeper. So you can find access to capital, and all of a sudden you have access to a huge amount of capital. That's an interesting observation, which means that don't think of it as being capital limited in the medium term. In the short term, you're always going to be capital limited because people are still skeptical. People are skeptical, people want to see lots of proof points, etc. We'll talk about this in a second. It's not so easy to get started in biotech, but it's not impossible either, okay?
Yeah.
All of this leads to
We have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
what would you say about the talent in Tel Aviv? Do you know the talent scene in Tel Aviv in biotech?
So they're asking, do you know what is the biotech talent scene in Tel Aviv or in Israel? Or Tel Aviv, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so there's actually, I think, two groups of talent pools in Israel, and I think they actually split a little bit, right? So one is split in Tel Aviv around the software scene. So there's a lot of good talent around that may be thinking about bioinformatic approaches or making software tools or using machine learning, for example, to solve biological problems. There's a very deep talent pool for that. And I think there's good interest in leveraging that talent pool. There's also, of course, because of the fungibility of software work, the ability of that software pool to work more globally with other folks and either be a part of a different company that exists somewhere else and provide some of that machine learning and or software functionality. And then there's another software pool which comes out of the Technion, which comes out of Tau, which comes out of the Weizmann Institute, right? That is more the classical, okay, we've actually been in a lab, like, we're lab monkeys like that work around and we've developed some new tool on the wetware side, or we've developed a new therapeutic approach or a new diagnostic approach. And those are also valuable pools of talent. But I think those pools of talent are not as well connected to the venture scene as the software folks are. That's often the case. I've seen the same, I'm from Germany myself, but I've seen the same thing in Berlin and other places. The software tools and the software players led the revolution of being more venture fundable. And now the biotech people came along with it, right? There's more startups coming out of Berlin, out of Munich and whatnot, than ever before on the biotech side. But it's been lagging the software side by maybe 15 years. And I think the same is similar in Tel Aviv and in Rehovot and of course in Haifa with the Technion and whatnot else. So having said that, I think the benefit of Israel, which we should recognize, is that it is not a large place. It's actually fairly compact. It's not far to go from Rehovot to Tel Aviv, so you can always meet up. And in pandemic times, I know that's more difficult, but don't forget that you can spend some time at another place and just meet people and get that brain connection going. That's really the principal part that makes some of these other superclusters like Boston and San Francisco so valuable, because there's a lot of people in that close by, so they meet up all the time. Right. And yes, it is difficult in pandemic times, but basically that's where I think these two groups exist. Sometimes they overlap, but I don't think they overlap so much in Israel. And maybe they should overlap more.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah. Having said that, if you're thinking about starting companies, you should go and introduce yourself. You should make yourself available. I'm not sure what the innovation networks are in Israel nowadays, but meetups I'm sure exist. I'm sure there's startup communities that exist and founder communities that exist and accelerators that meet up and whatnot else. So just participate in these plays and in these spaces so you know more people that are in the university space, in the development space. It's also really important to get connected to the tech transfer offices. I know they exist at all these universities. It's their job to make technology commercially available. And if you're not a biotech guy, that doesn't matter. You can just go there and say, like, hey, what kind of interesting tech do you have? Learning process. But certainly you will know that there's some patents that have been filed. Those patents have inventors. The inventors work at the university. If you're interested in patent, you should go talk to the inventors that work at the university. It's a process, but it's all possible.
Awesome.
Friction is low, generally speaking. Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, okay, good. So the friction is low, even there, right? It's mostly your own effort. You can lower costs, certainly. I mean, Israel does have the benefit of having a slightly lower cost of living than San Francisco and Boston and whatnot else. That does matter, right? So it just reduces your cost to actually deal with these startup costs, including wages and all these other consumables. And yet you have access to international pools of capital. So that's pretty exciting. So let's talk about Nikos a little bit. There's always the question like remote versus local, and that's of course supercharged in pandemic times. The thing about biotech is like anything you do in a lab is always local to some degree. It's always got to be local somewhere, right? So you can't completely distribute it. That doesn't work. So you have to have minimally small groups of people that work somewhere in labs. That's really, really important because unlike, actually somewhat like coding, but a little differently, there's so much more hand skill that is necessary to actually execute an assay correctly that usually means there's loops and loops and loops of troubleshooting that are ongoing by small groups of people clustering around the problem and fixing it in real time, near time, right? Like within numbers of days. And that has to happen somewhere, right? So basically you can disaggregate the enterprise. It's possible, but only to a certain lower limit to the atomization of the biotech enterprise. And you're experiencing that with lab groups, essentially. Call it like 3 to 5 people. They always have to be somewhere. Having said that, outsourcing does work, and it doesn't have to be your lab people that do the work, right? There's lots of other folks that do lab work for other people. You can call them cloud labs, or more traditionally, you can call them contract research organizations, or CROs. They exist. They may do mouse work for you. They may do assay design work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everything exists. Having said that, the old joke is like the same as when you buy robots. You're replacing a person that does work in the lab with a robot, and then you're hiring a person to actually deal with a robot, right? So you're not actually saving yourself a person. But you may actually be saving yourself some time because the throughput increases. That's fine. Similarly to outsourced manufacturers or providers of services, you'll always be dealing with them, so you actually have to expend significant management time on those. So don't think that those are like cookie cutter things. It's not like AWS where you can just buy an instance and that's fine. Everything here is like hand-holding and management because it's so much less defined and hardened. We're fundamentally operating in an undetermined system. That's how this goes. And then the last point here is the closer you are to the bleeding edge, that's actually really true on most of these advanced medicines. You just got to do it yourself. There's nobody that knows how to do this because you invented it, right? You invented the thing that you're actually trying to manufacture, so you have to do it yourself. And then there's the competition. That's an important part. There's more and more venture foundries. I'm actually not sure. This may be a question to the group. Is that true in Israel as well? I've seen this excessively now in the United States. Everybody seems to be doing this. Basically, venture companies decide that it's better to own the majority of the share capital than to invest in somebody else outside, right? Like usually it used to be like inventors come to venture capitalists and they take 20% of your company for like whatever, $10 million, give or take. Now, the venture companies like Flagship and Atlas and Third Rock and Versant Ventures and everybody else, they just do it themselves. They essentially employ a bunch of PhDs for not that much money and others, and they just create the company themselves. And then they source in everything else and essentially own the vast majority of the share capital. That's what happened with Moderna, arguably a very successful paradigm, and many others, not as successful companies. But that's what many companies are doing, venture funds, because they have the money and they realize that they can take all the talent from universities for reasonably small amounts of money and then just own that process and do that better. So how does it look in Israel?
Biotech.
Ready? Does it exist?
In technology, it exists. Teammate, there's an accelerator that almost the majority shares of, or all the shares of a startup.
So we have some foundries, but not around biotech.
Management is very similar.
The more on the software side. That is fair because that is the same thing that happened in Germany, right? So first it's around software, and eventually it goes into biotech. At least in the paradigm of these two things. Okay, good. So let's go further a little bit more. Why does it cost so much money, right? Because software has gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, quote unquote, right? The talent is expensive, but the actual way of doing software is not that expensive anymore. People forget this, and you're probably of a generation that has not had that experience, but friends of mine used to build servers themselves and spin up server farms themselves because there was no compute or host capacity anywhere. You used to have that shit yourself. You used to host your own website. I mean, the crazy idea about this, right? Like nowadays, it's not a thing anymore. And server farms and databases and all that, you gotta do all this yourself. So basically, software used to cost a lot of money because you had to invest in the hardware and the management of the hardware and everything else, right? That's all gone away. That's all disintermediated now. We're not there at all with biotech. So it costs a lot of money because you got to do everything yourself. You essentially got to manipulate the atoms yourself, unfortunately, which is the case. So the long and short is that the experiments cost a lot, and it takes a lot longer per unit of iteration. I've calculated a couple of quick things just to give you a baseline of what it looks like. If you wanted to work in the bacterial space and you do 36 generations, like doubling, it's like, roughly 12 hours. That's like one experimental cycle. You start with a thing and you let it go for like 12 hours to generate the appropriate material to see how it works on iteration. And then you assess and you do it over again. Now, if you work in yeast, which may be another background that you're working on, you're already 3 times slower. Okay. And if you work in the things that are actually interesting to us as humans, like mammalian cells themselves, eukaryotic mammalian cells, they're 60 times slower. So to get to the same place, it takes not 12 hours, but 30 days. That's really unfortunate, right? So every experimental cycle takes a month, which means that you got to parallelize a lot more. Fine, that's one way of doing it. But still, there's a minimum compressible time for you to actually get experimental results. That's really annoying. And then, of course, once you go to animals, that's very different, right? The generation cycle for adult mice is like a month itself. So that takes a lot longer than to go to the same level, so to get to the same level of iteration. So that's really one of the fundamental problems that you have with biotech. It takes longer, and you can't push a button and essentially get your results overnight, oftentimes. Having said that, it is also a species argument that's often used by people that don't want to work in a different way. So you can work much faster and much more in parallel, but you got to think about it differently, right? So this is one of those things where parallelization of experiments is critical, and thinking through the experimental path from the very beginning is also very critical. Doing it sequentially, it's the only thing you'll lose is time, and you will lose the race to the market, because now it is very aggressive about pushing into the market. First into a patient, first into a market is worth billions of dollars. Okay. Challenges. Let's talk about product market fit. So product market fit is sort of maximally free in software. You can do pretty much anything you want with software, that's fine. Right? As long as somebody's interested in it, you can do whatever you want. Like from Second Life all the way through whatever, PayPal or Bitcoin, like it doesn't really matter. You can do whatever. Some stuff is regulated, but most of the stuff is not regulated. In biotech, that's not the case. Almost anything you do in biotech is regulated. Almost anything, except tools to some degree, right? Biotech tools. But almost anything else is regulated because it touches living, self-replicating organisms. And there's good reason to be concerned about this. Software doesn't yet do this really freely for itself, but biotech can and does replicate itself oftentimes, right? We are replicating organisms, right? Our cells self-replicate, we replicate under the right conditions. And certainly plants and algae and shrimp and fish and whatever else, they all replicate. So you got to be a little bit more careful about this because the system is self-governing to a large extent and can evolve and or just get away from you. So that's why there's a lot more restriction on biotech, and that means you have to be a little bit more careful thinking about what product it really means. So means uncertainty is a lot higher. There's a lot more uncertainty in biotech, right? It's technical, fundamentally, underdetermined systems. Okay, that's one thing. Second thing is repeatability. A lot of the things that we do, certainly most everything that runs in academic labs, like needs to be repeated over and over and over again before I believe it. So the reason is that most experiments are extremely complex, and controlling complexity is not impossible, but it's hard. And making sure that the complexity is appropriately controlled is one of the key paths to success in biotech. And oftentimes, you rush, I myself have rushed, and have not appropriately controlled complexity, and it usually comes back and bites you in the ass. At the worst possible moment, generally speaking, okay? The markets are just so different. And the reason I say this, let's stick with the extreme example of red biotech for diagnostics or therapeutics. Who is your customer in the red biotech therapeutics market? Who is your customer? Anybody? Any ideas?
Insurance companies?
Yeah, it's the insurance companies and the federal regulator and the federal government, because in Israel too, there's state healthcare, right? Like, generally speaking.
Yeah.
So it's not just the insurance companies, but it's also the federal government and the reimbursement machinery of the federal government. That's really your customer. It's not the physicians, it's certainly not the patients, right? It's not the patients, which is really interesting. So they're not your customer, right? They don't pay oftentimes, and they shouldn't, I believe. So basically, you have to, from the beginning, deal with the company, insurance companies, or an actor that wants to pay you as little as possible, right? That's a really important understanding. And you also got to recognize that there's this other layer. It's not just the reimbursement layer, it's also the approval layer. You got to go through a lot of hurdles to get this approved. Again, federal regulation. So fundamentally, what you're dealing with is a regulated market. Now, that's a negative view. You can take a positive view. Oh, okay, I think about Michael Porter, the Harvard professor, like barriers to entry. Yeah, the barriers to entry are actually really high. That's good for you too. If you get over those barriers, everybody else has a lot of work to get to where you are as well. So there's pros and cons, right? Once you're over the barrier, you're in good shape. That's really important to recognize as well. And oftentimes that translates to significant benefits for yourself. Not just from an IP perspective, that's another barrier, but basically just getting your drug approved is actually very, very, very non-trivial. Okay? Okay. Another thing, talent and skills. It's rare. It's true everywhere though, right? But basically, you're dealing here with very specialized skill sets. And interestingly enough, unlike on the software side, the technical skill is hard to assess. Just because somebody published papers in fancy journals doesn't mean anything, literally. They could be complete dud. They could be smart-ish, right? But they could not know how to actually help you make a drug or a therapeutic or a diagnostic or make you meat or whatever else it is. On the coding side nowadays, with all of these like HackerRank and all these other remote assessments, it's actually much closer, at least for many of the contributing workforce that is not in the planning space, but rather in just like writing code space. You can actually assess their skills fairly nicely. That does not work at all in the biotech space just yet. And that's actually one of the things that maybe we should figure out together. How can we do this better for biotech space? How can you assess the quality of, let's say, a line operator on the lab side remotely or in a standardized format? I've thought about giving people thought experiments because as scientists, you're supposed to think, and many people are remarkably poor thinkers, actually. But there's more. There's the actual technical skill in the lab that's really hard to assess. So in any case, that doesn't easily translate. So there's a lot of hiring mistakes, not mistakes. There's just a lot of poor hiring outcomes. Just doesn't work. So that increases the cost enormously. That sets you back in terms of time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You do have to, like I said, get local workforce somewhere for your labs. That is how I go. It doesn't matter what you do. If you work in a lab, somebody's got to be local. So wherever that is, that's where you got to go and grab for the talent pool. And data analysis is still rare in biotech. So it's really unfortunate, but oftentimes people that go into biotech fields are not as savvy or don't want to be as savvy on the math, on the data manipulation, and so on and so forth. So there's a pretty big gap that I would very much like to close more. Because at the end of the day, everything we do is we generate data. And this is one of the things that fundamentally did not track for me, but many folks are just, oh yeah, no, our data is different than data that computer scientists deal with. I was like, no, it's really not. It's really the same kind of data. It's either image data, or it's like numerical data, or it's categorical data. It's all just data. So fundamentally, there's a big gap in the data savviness in biology. And that actually means there's a big opportunity to solve for that, to train for that, to support that with tools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? Development speed, data speed, okay? As I told you, it's slower. Certainly a lot slower on the computational than on the software development side. But it also really is given by the fact that some of the work that we can do in bacteria, which is really fast generation times, and oftentimes we can't do that work, and we need to do it in eukaryotic mammalian background. So the iteration speed is really just days to usually months. And that is hard for many software folks that are native to software to understand and swallow, and there's a huge risk of having misaligned expectations. So think about it, it's guaranteed to be slower, sometimes by an order of magnitude, sometimes by 2 orders of magnitude than software data speed. Really critical to understand, okay? Unlike, again, with software, again, I use this software paradigm as a sharp contrast, but it extends to other fields. But specifically software, you have to make the thing at some point in time, right? You can't just click push and it gets published and then the code's in production. Great. When we mean it's in production, actually, it does need to be produced. That means there needs to be a manufacturing process and qualification, and the thing runs with a certain... You're making physical things at the end of the day, right? And you're making them in a very clean way, usually, for therapeutics and diagnostics, and even a clean way for any kind of like food stuff. So there's a high degree of control that needs to be exerted on top of it, which means cost, which means time. So that time scale is measured in quarters to years, and then the same is true for clinical trials. If you're so lucky to be a field that requires clinical trials, quarters to years, right? And you're doing this while you're burning money left and right? So you're paying your staff, and it's just years before you get anywhere. So remember that it is something that you're doing while you're in flight, and you're paying for everything, including overhead, including your lawyers, including all your lab stuff. Everything you're doing on the development side then has to go to manufacturing, then has to go on the clinical trial. So you're looking at a much longer block while you're spending money all the way. So the capital requirements are just a lot higher from the beginning. It does set an effective entry hurdle, which is really nice, right? So if you don't have a lot of capital, it's hard for you to really compete with the same players. So if you don't have a 50 million or 100 million Series A round, it makes it harder to play with the big boys. It doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it a lot harder. So usually the goal is now to go for a seed round, 5 to 10 million, maybe 15 million seed round, and then go for like a 50 to 100 million Series A. The cap table also is fundamentally different. Forget owning 50% of your company. That does not work anymore. If somebody gives you $50 million, they own most of your company. That's just how that goes. Having said that, it still should be incredibly valuable if you're going for a therapeutics play. One of my good friends, Tim, just went public today with his company, announced a stock deal. I know for a fact that he doesn't own the majority of his company anymore, but the deal values the company at like a couple of $1 billion now. So it's okay to have a small share of a couple of $1 billion company. Many rounds of funding are required. That's true, right? I said seed A, probably also B and a C. Tim raised, I want to say $250 million, give or take, before going public over like 3 years. That's a lot of money. But it includes hiring several hundred people, including buying a manufacturing site. So lots of stuff you need. It's very capital intensive. Again, effective barrier to entry. Having said that, you got to be comfortable raising money. You got to be good at raising money. It's a skill. And you got to be okay not owning the majority of your company by far. The last part I struck out, you will not want to sell products. It's true in certain fields, like for example, Red Biotech, you can get acquired and go public happily before even starting clinical trials. That does work for Tim and others. But in other places, you can and do want to sell products, and we'll get to that. All right. So further, the difference between software and biotech. Any questions, by the way, then just yell them out. Otherwise, I'll just keep going.
Yeah, we have a question.
Yes.
You said that the time scale is different, but 3 years to go public is extremely fast, no? Isn't it?
So 3 years to go public is extremely fast. So the time scale is.
Yes, so let's talk about different timescales, right? Okay, so this is true. So there's a timescale for the company development and company age, okay? And there's a timescale to bring a product to market and or to get technical with stuff. So for Tim and his company, Senti, you can look them up, SENTI. They went public, or they announced the deal today. But basically, Tim has been working in his lab for the last decade or so. So the company spun out of MIT, out of his lab. So working on that stuff for a decade before really going public with all this, right? So there's a very long development path, which it's like the iceberg, right? Not everything is visible, oftentimes. And it's invariable that you have to spend a lot of time figuring this stuff out on the biotech side. It is hard. Somebody has to put that effort in. It doesn't have to be you. That's what I'm saying. Like, you could go to tech transfer office and say, like, hey, is there somebody like Tim there that I want to talk to, right? Maybe that person spent 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years developing something really fundamentally awesome. He's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I will put this now together. And then you can actually go and raise money and go very fast. That is true, right? So there's 2 different time scales that I want you to keep in mind, okay?
That's nice.
It's interesting, actually. There's been an interesting post you may want to think about from Bruce Booth from Atlas Ventures. You may want to look him up. Booth, Booth. He did an analysis. He has a wonderful blog, by the way, that I highly recommend for everybody. And he did an analysis of how long it takes for companies for assets to monetize, right? And actually, lately, biotech assets monetize faster for liquidity, because he's an investor from a liquidity perspective, than software assets. And I found that really interesting. So software assets tended to stay private longer than biotech assets.
That's awesome. Another question? Yeah.
What if I don't want to play with the big boys and want to have a conventional cap table?
Just a
But-
second.
Yeah, but basically sell my company to Pfizer, or one of the big boys. Like, not release a product, but have it like
Can you
develop it to a certain stage and then sell it at an early stage.
can you sell to to the big boys at an earlier stage. We're looking at
Yeah.
a quick exit or something. Yeah.
Some companies can. So Tim had, I'm sure, offers to get acquired too, but he chose to go public. That's fine. You can go and get acquired if you're either a tool, often, or a therapeutics company. Most other companies do not. So remember, we have this rainbow of biotech. We have red and blue and green and gray and so on and so forth and white. It does not work in most spaces, but it does work in therapeutics and it does work in tools. And it's basically the two ends, right, off the spectrum. Everything else in between. Why these two ends? Well, one, on the life sciences tool side, it's very easy to monetize that asset further. So if I'm Thermo Fisher or another large tools company, I see like, oh, that genome compiler thing, that's kind of cute, or somebody has a new assay to like crack DNA or whatever the hell. It's like, okay, cool. I can value it fairly quickly. I have no regulation. It usually fits in with my own manufacturing and sales process, so I can just, and it's accretive and I'd be done with it. Small multiple usually on either revenue that you already have or essentially forward projected revenue. Fine. Most of the tools deals are in call it like tens to low hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's a good outcome for tools because usually they're not as capital intensive either. On the other hand, on the therapeutic side, you can be acquired for pure optionality. So large drug companies, Pfizer, Roche, Novartis, they're so big that they're okay to acquire you at an early stage because they don't want you to get too big and get positive data on the clinical trials, because then your valuation skyrockets exponentially. Having said that, a lot of these deals are very heavily backloaded. So basically what that means is you get a solid amount of upfront, and that's usually all that you can recognize, and some of the money goes to the founders and others go to the venture capitalists. And then 80% of the deal value is backloaded, milestones, right? When somebody announces like an $800 million deal, you should look at the fine print. It's usually like $100 million up front and $700 million on the back end. And the reason that this is the case is that it is so uncertain. So you can make those deals, and it does work, and sometimes the milestones get hit and everybody's happy, and oftentimes they don't, because that's how biotech works. So basically, there's a lot of option deals like that that get struck. So those are the two ends, and I don't see anything in the middle usually. I haven't seen anything really in the food space. I haven't seen anything really in the diagnostic space. You get acquired in the diagnostic space, but usually once you have revenue, and then it's a pretty straight, 10x on revenue deal kind of thing. That kind of works. For industrial biotech, same thing, right? If you have revenue, you get acquired based on revenue. But option value is usually only priced in when you're either on the tool side or on the red biotech side. Okay?
Yep. Thanks.
Cool.
Yep.
All right. Product market fit. That's hard to say. We're running a little behind. I do apologize, but it's such a fun topic overall. Product market fit really matters here too a lot. People that say like, oh, product market fit's not a thing that we need to do, is like, it's fine, if I build it, they will come. It's obviously untrue. It's total insanity, and I think people have started to realize, biotech entrepreneurs have started to realize that product market fit matters, right? So what are the audiences? Not the actual final customers, but the different audiences. Like most everything else, a lot of people can say no to your product and that can tag your company, but very few people can actually say yes to it. So red, physicians, right? So B2C is typically not possible. For therapeutics, you can't do that. For DX nowadays, a little bit more, especially with COVID, I want to leave that as a seed in your mind. Is there a straight-to-consumer diagnostic approach? The answer is yes. I think there's huge value to it, like the democratization of your own health data, such as with CO2, VO2 sensors and other things like that. I would love to know more about myself. I can't because I'm not enabled to do so. I would love to understand what my blood composition is because I'm a nerd like that. But there is value for us as humans to know more about our own body as we're living in our own body, right? I know more about how my website is doing than about myself, which is kind of crazy. So that's really insane, right? I can measure my weight and my blood pressure and my blood oxygen, and that's about it, right? With any kind of frequency of sampling. That's the crazy part about it. I can sample anything else in the world with much greater frequency than myself because I'm not structurally able to do so. And I think that there's a big disruption that should be coming soon. Green, that's B2B, that's big. Ag, food. White, B2B, definitionally. Tools is different. That's B2C if you consider the academic market. Blue, that's B2B for now, right? But some B2C plays again with proteins like that. Pink, that's the food side. That's B2C a lot, right? That's all food, impossible foods, Beyond Meat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then gray, which is space, That's all grant funded for now, right? So there's no customer market. It's fun space, but it's really just like mostly exploratory. Okay. Risk reward profiles. Let's talk about that, and we'll do case studies for a second here. Okay. So value, input versus probability adjusted output dollars. It is interesting, right? So it's so very, very binary. It's really crazy, right? On the therapeutic side. Again, if Tim's company is successful, them going public is the beginning of a very large growth. Like, think about Moderna, right? Moderna is an interesting approach. They went public and they were valued at like $7 billion. And people thought like, oh my God, that's too high even for them, because vaccines, like back in 2017 or 2018 when they went public, like, who cares about vaccines? And now look where we are here, right? So they're worth, I don't know, $120 billion, give or take. So there's very limited upside to biotech companies, and I know that's an extreme example with the pandemic, but it same holds true for anything that's drug related, cancer related, everything else. By the way, the biggest selling drug in the world is not a vaccine, still isn't, right? It's antibodies against rheumatoid arthritis, Enbrel and Humira from AbbVie and I forget, Roche or Genentech, respectively. Still, right? Because those are very expensive. Like vaccines, you sell a lot of them, but they're actually very cheap. And it's part of the point. And vaccines should prevent you from getting sick, which is really great. Selling therapeutics. The sad story about therapeutics, especially around cancer, is like they rarely cure you. They help a lot, but they don't really cure you. Good and bad, right? Good and bad is like they help treat you, but they sometimes don't cure the underlying condition. Which from an economics perspective is good for you because you just keep selling your drugs. Okay. Red Biotech, ultra high alpha on the therapeutic side, medium alpha on the diagnostic side, low alpha on the medical device side. Medical devices is actually an interesting field, but it's challenging because a lot of it is thought of prosthetics or pacemakers or implants or anything like that. But medical devices could and should also be wearables, and I think there's an interesting opportunity in the future there. Green and white and blue and pink, all of that in there, right? So when you're looking at that, it's mostly you're looking at the opportunity spectrum from the United States, where I'm located. Green is the USDA and EPA, so there's regulatory agencies that look to have to be looked at. The scale is very different. You're looking at very large scale. You're looking at fields that you have to water, you have to plant, and so on. So it's not the individual small milliliter that you inject into a human, but you need like gallons or like hectoliters, all that stuff. The proof requirements are also pretty high. Like farmers are very skeptical. The USDA is very skeptical. And the reason for that is partially fair because you have a field that's out in the open. You're not even running a clinical trial where you have somebody under close observation. Like, it's a field. All right, I come back in 6 months and we'll see what grows. And whatever happens in the meantime. It's crazy. So the fact that some of this actually works at all and is allowed is interesting, right? So we've accepted that there's some risk that we just price in and off we go. But there's hurdles. Industrial applications, same thing. It's usually EPA. Blue Biotech, not canonical right now. There's interesting questions like, what if you do it in the ocean? Like, who is responsible for that all of a sudden? Like, if I farm out in the open ocean, it's international waters. Is it because I'm from the United States that I follow the U.S. law? There's good debate. I don't think the last word is written there. And then there's pink biotech, huge growth, and that's usually also USDA in the United States here, but sometimes also FDA because the F and the FDA stands, of course, for food. Okay, cost really quickly, and then we do case studies, which is fun, and we can wrap this up.
We have a question. Mike, can we
Yeah.
make a question?
Go ahead.
You in the previous slide, if you could go back.
You could go back to the previous slide.
In Pink Biotech, you said there's fish being considered. I haven't heard of any fish substitute, and that's actually really interesting to hear about. If you have any more information on that.
You said there's fish. There's in Pink Biotech. There's someone making like artificial fish meat.
Yeah, so there's salmon, there's shrimp, there's a bunch of other stuff. I can find you some references, but there's a whole bunch of folks that are starting to work on this. Interestingly enough, not all located in the United States or in Europe, but actually in Asia, right? Because Asia in general is consuming fish protein quite a bit more coastline, a lot more fisheries, so it's a more close substitute to the nutrients and nutritional profiles of what people are consuming in there. So shrimp, certainly, and then also salmon.
Awesome. I'll follow up for reference afterwards.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I can provide those. And there's actually a really good guy that I can connect you to who's also a very fun speaker because he's got lots of good opinions. Ryan Bethencourt. He's the founder of Wild Earth and whatnot. And yeah, he's a fun dude. Good friend.
Okay.
Okay. The cost. Israel. It costs money. Space. You can't work from home. You need to have a lab. That costs money. Oftentimes, biotech is characterized by moving clear liquids from one bucket to the next and then throwing it away at the end. I'm not trying to be funny, but that's the game, right? You do a lot of experiments, and every time you do this, you're moving small amounts of liquid, and it costs you a lot of money. How much does a single pipette tip cost? Like, anybody have an intuition?
Count pipetta?
$250.
$250? We have $250.
No, not the pipette. The small plastic tip that goes on top of it. Just the tip that you use once, and then you throw it away.
10 cents. 10 cents?
Yeah, sometimes 10 cents, but oftentimes like 2 to 3 cents, which does not sound like a lot. But I myself, as a scientist, can easily go through a couple of thousand pipette tips a day. That very quickly scales up, very, very quickly. And you have robots, they go through lots of it. That's just one component that actually gets consumed a lot. So everything costs money in biotech. And then I'm sure Tel Aviv specifically is not a cheap place to buy any property in. But if you compare that to San Francisco or Boston, you can try to get like some space here. So 100 square foot triple net, that was 2 years ago. I think that's more now. That means for 10,000 square feet, it's 1.2 million a year just in rent, right? But that's probably very cheap nowadays. So it's probably closer to 2 million a year just to have the space to work in. And 10,000 square feet is not large. It's like 1,000 square meters when you have to have everything in there, right? So that's very important. Equipment kind of costs money. The licensing, that costs money too. When you have patents, and oftentimes biotech runs on patents, you got to pay somebody for the patents. You got to pay the lawyers to prosecute them. You got to pay the university royalties and so on and so forth, right? All of that costs a lot of money. Okay, let's wrap this up quickly here in terms of money. Let's do a couple of case studies, the good, the bad, the ugly. There's actually some fun updates on some of this. So, the good. It's awesome when it works, right? Kite and Juno, you can cure uncurable cancer. And it's kind of magical, right? So that's one of the reasons that biotech is fascinating, because fundamentally, it is indistinguishable from magic nowadays. You can cure an uncurable cancer. People that were doomed to die now don't die anymore. I don't think anybody on the software side has a similar strong value proposition when it's at this extreme. Oftentimes it's not like, okay, we can treat your rheumatoid arthritis. It's great, but it's less strong. But in the most extreme, those are the kinds of statements that make people put lots of money in there, put like their entire life's work behind it, and so on and so forth. And that's acceptable, I think. That's a good trade for us as humans to make. The second thing that's also fascinating is gene therapy. Genetic therapy, somebody is born with a genetic defect, and we can now cure that. That means that all of a sudden, something that you're born with that is a disease is not a disease anymore. I think that's magical. There's initial trials that have people that are born blind can now see shapes. That is magical. Somebody that is blind can now see shapes, roughly, right? That is something that does not exist in any other field that I'm familiar with. Everything else helps and so on and so forth, but this is something that gets so close to us as humans and our core being. That's why this is a fascinating field to be in, in my opinion. And we should not forget that. Now here, we have, of course, our good friend Omri. This is actually from 2012 when we met, from that Simba Beta. And this is what he looks. So there you go.
He's talking next week to the Flash.
Yeah, there you go. So you can for it. You get like, this is what you look like, and that's what you say. That's what 10 years ago, right?
It's like Bezos. It's like Jeff Bezos.
Huh?
It's like Jeff Bezos.
It is a little bit like Jeff Bezos, exactly right. Mine has a couple head. But so Twist Biosciences, I just looked up the valuation. That was actually yesterday. They IPO'd in 2018 at $372 million, and now they're worth $4.3 billion. All right? So 3 years. That's not bad. And they're still growing strongly. Emily is obviously a force of nature. She's super awesome. I love her. But that's one of those awesome things. It's fundamentally a tools company. They make DNA. Right? So a huge amount of value that can be created. All right. Wrong way. There we go. All right, Pink Biotech. Impossible Foods. About $7 billion valuation. They raised $2.1 billion. Why so much money? Because they're actually making things, right? And it's available everywhere in the US. I'm actually not sure if it's available in Israel, but it's available in the US, it's available in Europe, and whatnot else. And basically, I just grabbed a screenshot from, like, you type in Google, and you can buy it everywhere. That's success. That stuff actually tastes like meat. Fun question. Why does it taste like meat? Does anybody know? Because it is plant protein. But why does it taste like meat?
They make him.
They make heme.
Yeah. They
They
Yes.
just make heme. Yeah.
So they make heme.
Yeah.
And what is the heme fundamentally?
part of the hemoglobin complex.
Part of the hemoglobin complex.
Right,
I'm
which is a
taking credit
part
for
of
the right
that's
answer.
that's very good. Get credit for the right answer. So fundamentally, we as humans actually like the taste of blood. That's what makes meat, and that's what enjoys us. That's what we enjoy. So we love the taste of blood. They figured this out. So if you can make anything taste like blood, essentially, all right, we'll just eat it. So that's good for us to understand. Alrighty, now the bad, classical scam, all right, or fraud, Theranos. And this is important because they raised a lot of money, right? $9 billion valuation, didn't ever publish any data, no biotech VCs invested, they still got a ton of money, the technology never worked. And now, of course, the lady's on trial and the jury's deliberating and maybe she'll go to jail. I would hope she goes to jail because she should. She'd be fraud investors or anything else. But basically, that's a classical scam, right? So when things look like they're too good to be true and you don't ever publish data, there's a rule in science like that doesn't work. You don't have to believe in science. The data is just the data, right? And either you publish the data and the data works or it doesn't. That's the difference. There's also the bad. You can mess up in many ways. Like there's billing fraud that goes on. Ubiome, another company out of San Francisco, unfortunately, right? Like they raised a huge amount of money. Again, no biotech VCs invested. The FBI raided their offices and the founders and co-CEOs, they're out, layoffs, actually, they fled the country and they're not in the US anymore. So they're evading and they're fugitives now. This is another reason that again, remember that we talked about insurances? They actually defrauded insurance companies in order to make the revenue, in order to make their company work. That's really terrible. And the pressure is high to make it work. And like I said early on, you have to deal with the insurance system and it can be pretty brutal. But if you don't figure it out from the beginning, this is obviously not the way to make it work. And then lastly, I think that's actually pretty sad, unfortunately, is antibiotics companies, Archaeogen and Tetraphase. They're both antibiotics companies. Both developed novel antibiotics, not Me Too's or anything else. They both worked, and they both got approved, and they both went bankrupt. Why is that? Well, part of the reason is that antibiotics do work still, and they cure. Remember the earlier statement about curing. If you take antibiotics, you've probably all taken antibiotics in your life multiple times over, right? They work, by and large. Are they expensive drugs? Did you ever have to pay anything like more than a couple bucks for a couple antibiotics?
No, they're good.
I don't think you do. Right? So they do work, and that's part of the problem. So new innovation is not valued in this space. So just because you're going into biotech and into drug development, you got to look very carefully about how innovation is valued in your space. And they said, we'll do it anyways, There's a huge public need for new antibiotics. That's true. But will anybody pay for it? And the short answer right now is no. So this is not a scientific problem. This is not a regulatory problem. Because the science works, you can't find new antibiotics, you can't get new antibiotics approved. It's fine. It is a reimbursement problem. So actually what you need to figure out is how that reimbursement for value for something that provides safety for future generations and ideally should never be used can be priced. Because otherwise there will not be much new innovation. That's a challenge, right? So be very careful when you're going into biotech, into therapeutics. Just because somebody says we need new antibiotics, that is a true statement, but you got to be able to make money off of it. Otherwise, you don't get to keep playing, as unfortunately both Archaeogen and Tetraphase demonstrate. Okay, so fundraising, we can.
What about
Question, yes.
Are there some successful nonprofits that made new kinds of antibiotics?
Are there successful non-profits that made new antibiotics cures?
Not yet. Great question. There are some thoughts about funding antibiotic development. So there's funding agencies that exist that are transnational that try to provide some of this. There's thought about forming nonprofits to do this work. It's about reimbursing differently, especially the United Kingdom actually has been leading some of these efforts.
You're breaking up.
That's not
תחזיר
good.
בחזרה, לא הבנתי.
Testing?
Yeah. Let's try again.
Yeah. So I was saying that there is no nonprofit yet, but actually the United Kingdom has been leading a lot of these efforts.
Sorry.
Is
No.
I think
That's okay. United
Okay,
Kingdom
good.
has been leading a lot of these efforts.
yeah, the United Kingdom has been leading a lot of these efforts, but since Brexit, that's actually stopped. So that's very disappointing, unfortunately. Right, the Brexit has taken a lot of these good initiatives and they're just gone. So, any case, there is no nonprofit yet to do antibiotics development. Maybe there should be. Okay, let's wrap this up with conclusions here. All right, the field, the opportunity is high. Yes, it is binary, right? The funding requirement is also high, right? It's not binary in this case. The funding availability is high. That's pretty good. The timelines are long. The talent need is high. The risk is high. The de-risking is slow and incomplete, but the defensibility is also high. So pros and cons, right? Very important. But just when you go into it, do it as a team. Ideally, a team of some software people, some biotech people if you're coming from the software field. Very helpful. Okay? That's most of what I got.
Fantastic. Any question, anyone? No?
Can you
Okay.
tell us about some interesting things happening, like how to help this research happen and be more productive? Maybe rule out possibilities that don't work.
במה? Can you share some of the חדשים כאילו?
Innovative.
Some of the more recent? No, I need to... לא הבנתי עוד פעם. זה מה אני שואל.
כאילו האם יש דברים שעובדים על, כאילו ספציפית בתחום של תרפיוטיקס, שעוזרים לנו לעשות רול אאוט לדברים בשלב מוקדם, בשביל לעשות את ה... כמו שדיבר על
Are
DNS.
there tools or platforms that help us speed up and rule out faster?
Yeah. Oh, okay. A little bit. So there are some predictive tools that exist, certainly, with regards to protein design. They're very specialized on these sides, but there's some actual baseline work that is very valuable, especially for software companies to engage in. It is the general management of data acquisition and making sure that the data acquired is robust and safe and so on. On the basic side, so I'm a huge fan of an Israeli company called Labguru, and they essentially, it's an electronic lab notebook. You may not think that that's really important, but it's very, very, very important, because a lot of the times it's really still like paper notebooks that people use, and it's crazy, right? So that doesn't make the data shareable, that doesn't make the data standardizable, and so on and so forth. So making sure the data is shareable, de-siloed, properly tagged somewhere is one of the biggest levers of value creation that I think can exist. And tools that do this help us accelerate the work because essentially it makes all the work visible more quickly.
Right. Thank you.
Fantastic. I got to jump to another meeting.
Thank you so much,
It was
Mike.
a pleasure to speak. I wish this was in person because I always enjoy this. But any questions, ping me. I'm here to chat, okay?
You're awesome, Mike. Thank you so much.
Thank you.